Chapter 1. Anna Simmons leaned back in her chair in the schoolroom and let out a sigh of relief. It was finally over. She'd been teaching in the little schoolroom outside of Beckham, Massachusetts for 2 years, and she wasn't going to go back. She couldn't. There had to be another job she could take. She loved children, but she hated teaching, and she just couldn't keep doing it indefinitely. She had enough money saved up that she could continue to pay her room and board to the family she'd lived with for a few more months until she found another job. There had to be something she could do that didn't involve teaching. It wasn't that she didn't like children, because she did. She just didn't feel like teaching was her calling. She hated disciplining the children, and even more, she hated trying to force them to learn things they had no interest in. At her little school, there was a group of siblings that obviously were not disciplined at all at home. They were so bad, it was almost impossible for Anna to teach, and they'd taken what little joy she'd had from teaching away from her, so now there was only frustration left. She shook her head. No, she was finished teaching, and no one was ever going to be able to convince her to go back to it. She gathered up the last of her things and erased the chalkboard, happy to know it was the last time ever her hands would be covered with chalk dust. She was thrilled to be closing the book on this chapter of her life and starting another, whatever it may be. She locked the schoolhouse behind her and walked the 2 miles to town without ever looking back. She was not going to miss a single thing about teaching. Why women wanted to do it year after year was beyond her comprehension. She wanted to spend her life with a man she loved. Not spend it in the schoolroom forcing disobedient children to learn. She wouldn't do it ever again. When she reached town, she wasn't certain where to start, so she went into the mercantile and slowly walked up to the owner. She'd always been excessively shy, and having to talk to strangers made her tongue swell in her mouth. She talked to Mr. Stanley many times over the years, but still, every time she saw him again, she had to start all over. She did her best not to mumble as she spoke to him. "Mr. Stanley? Are you hiring?" It was hard for her to get the words out. How was she supposed to ask for a job when she could barely talk around strangers? The middle-aged man looked her up and down. "Why you looking for work? Need something to do for the summer?" He knew she'd been teaching for the past 2 years, so he was obviously surprised at her question. She shook her head. "No, sir. I'm not going back to teaching." It was the first time she'd said the words aloud, and she was surprised at how powerful they made her feel. He frowned. "I don't have work for you. Teaching's the best job for a single lady." He waved to the bulletin board at the back of the store. "Sometimes folks will put their jobs on the bulletin board so people looking for work can find it. Sometimes not. I don't know what's up there now." Anna nodded and whispered, "Thank you," before heading back over to read the notices. There were more than she'd imagined there would be. Most were people looking for farm hands and such. She slowly read each one. Only one really had potential, and that one meant she would be a cook for a local wealthy family. She could do that. They wanted professional cooking experience, but what could be better than cooking in an orphanage? As she was about to leave, another advertisement caught her eye, this one printed professionally. She picked it up and pocketed it, preferring the idea of working as a cook, but knowing she would come back to it if she needed to. She wasn't too proud to do what she needed to do to survive. She walked a few blocks to the wealthy side of town to talk to the family looking for a cook, hoping they would at least give her a chance. She knew if anyone would just let her try to cook for them, she would have the job. Getting an interview and a chance would be the hard part. The family looking for the cook had just hired one, and told her she really didn't have the kind of experience they needed anyway. She walked to the small park across the street from the family's house and pulled the other advertisement out of her skirt pocket and slowly read it. Mail order bride agency needs women who are looking for the adventure of their lives. Men out west need women to marry. Reply in person at 300 Rock Creek Road. See Miss Elizabeth Miller. She shuddered as she read the name Miller, but surely the family she knew couldn't be related to a woman who owned a mail order bride agency. Anna read the words 3 times before she realized they weren't going to change before her eyes. Did she really have the courage to go and talk to a total stranger and ask if she could be a mail order bride? And then would she be able to be a mail order bride? She really wasn't certain. It was hard enough to just speak to a man, let alone marry one she'd never met. She got to her feet and noted the address, knowing she had to do it immediately or she would lose the courage to do it at all. She walked through the quiet streets to Rock Creek Road, just 2 blocks over from the house she was starting at. When she reached the house in question, she bowed her head and said a quick prayer, before rushing up the sidewalk to the front door. She knocked and waited impatiently, wishing she'd taken the time to change into her Sunday dress instead of just wearing one of her school dresses. She looked down and saw chalk dust all over her skirt. She was just about to turn away and return the following day when the door opened. A tall blond man greeted her. "May I help you?" he asked. If not for the formal butler clothes, the man looked as if he should be in a boxing ring. Even with his suit on, she couldn't help but notice how thick his muscles were. "I'm here to see Elizabeth Miller," she mumbled. He nodded, opening the door wider and inviting her inside. "Your name, miss?" She swallowed hard, wishing she wasn't so nervous around men. "It's Simmons. Anna Simmons." "Right this way, Miss Simmons." He led her toward the back of the house to a room where a young lady sat at a desk. She had blonde hair and green eyes, and stood when the door opened. "Miss Anna Simmons is here to see you, Miss Miller." Elizabeth smiled. "Thank you for showing her in, Bernard. Would you bring us some tea and cookies, please?" She turned to Anna and smiled. "Please have a seat. I hope you like tea." Anna nodded as she walked to the sofa. "I do like tea." She crossed her hands in her lap and gave all her attention to Elizabeth. She had no idea what to say, so she hoped the other woman would begin the conversation and save her the embarrassment. She just couldn't form her thoughts into a sentence. Elizabeth seemed to be waiting for something, but after a moment she asked, "Are you here about the mail order bride advertisement?" Anna blushed and nodded. Only a ninny wouldn't announce why she was there first thing. Why was she always a ninny? "Yes, I am." "Tell me why you want to be a bride," Elizabeth said, taking her seat again at the chair in front of the desk and giving Anna her full attention. Anna shrugged. "I was raised in the orphanage here in town, and I am too old to live there now, of course. So, I became a teacher, and I've been teaching for 2 years now. I hate it. I love children, but I hate teaching. I looked to see if there were any jobs for women in town, but there was only one for a cook, and the position is filled, and I really wasn't qualified anyway." Anna knew she was rambling, but she couldn't seem to stop. "So I saw your advertisement for a mail order bride, and thought that might work for me, but I'm so terribly shy, I'm not even certain that would work. I feel like there's something wrong with me that I can't talk to people at all, and here I am just saying anything that comes to mind, and I feel like an idiot." Elizabeth smiled. "You're not an idiot. It's got to be hard to be so shy and to be totally alone in the world." She turned and looked through her stack of letters, finding one halfway down and handing it to her. "I think Tom would be good for you. He lives outside a small town in Texas, and he's a rancher there." Anna read through his letter quickly. "Dear Elizabeth, I'm looking for a bride, as I'm sure are most people who write to you. I'm not particular about looks, but I would like to have a woman who is willing to work hard. I have a relatively large spread outside of Wiggyville, Texas, and I need someone who is willing to take care of my home and can cook my meals. I'm easy to get along with, and I have enough money to support a wife, but there's not a lot left over at this point. I've taken over my ranch from my parents who moved back east. Please find me a bride who doesn't mind hard work and is happy to live in the middle of nowhere. Thank you, Tom Harding." Anna read the letter one more time before nodding. "I think he's fine. What do I do now?" She felt her hand shaking nervously at the idea of responding to this man, but she knew it was the right thing for her future. Elizabeth handed her a pencil and a sheet of crisp white paper. "Write him a letter. Tell him about yourself, and we'll take it from there." Anna nodded, putting pencil to paper. "Dear Tom, I live in Beckham, Massachusetts, and I think I'd be a good wife to you. I'm a good cook, and I really don't mind cleaning. I would be a hard-working wife. I'm incredibly shy, though, so you'd have to be patient with me. I might even try to turn tail and run home once I get there. I've never been comfortable around men, but if you can handle that, I'm happy to marry you. I'm 20 years old, and I would be happy to live in the middle of nowhere, keeping house and raising a family. Sincerely, Anna Simpson." She handed the letter to Elizabeth, waiting while she read it. Elizabeth said nothing as she sealed and addressed the letter. It usually takes about 2 weeks to receive a response. "Once I have, I'll contact you, and we'll talk." She leaned back in her chair. "Did you grow up here in Beckham?" "Yes, I grew up in the orphanage here in town." My father died in the war between the states, and my mama died of the fever a few weeks after I was born. She shrugged. There was no family left to care for me, so a neighbor dropped me at the orphanage. She told the story many times, and she wasn't sad about it, but she felt like something was wrong because she wasn't. Should she be sad about a family she had no memory of? Elizabeth sighed. I'm sorry. What about you? Did you grow up here? Anna leaned back on the sofa, at ease for the first time in a long while. She'd lived as a boarder while teaching and didn't know the family well. She had no real friends outside of the orphans she'd grown up with, and they'd all moved off and had lives of their own. Yes, I did. I grew up on a farm outside town. My sister was a mail order bride a few years back. She settled in Texas near Fort Worth. She frowned. I wish I could travel out with you and visit her for a while. I haven't seen Susan since she married. Is Susan happy? Anna couldn't help but worry that she was making a terrible mistake moving somewhere where she knew no one to marry a stranger. Elizabeth nodded. Oh, yes. She's very happy. She has 4 stepsons and 3 children of her own. We write every week. 7 children? Oh my. Your parents didn't mind her going to Texas to marry a stranger? Not really. Susan wasn't happy at home. Our younger brothers and sisters are called the demon horde around town. Elizabeth shook her head as if trying to deny her own words. Anna's eyes widened. I had 6 of your siblings in school this year. She tried not to shudder visibly at the thought of them. Elizabeth grinned, nodding to the butler as he came in and set down a tray with tea and cookies before leaving the room, closing the door behind him. They've certainly earned their name, haven't they? Anna nodded emphatically. They're a great deal of the reason I've decided to quit teaching. After she said the words, she wondered if she'd gone too far. Would Elizabeth be offended and not help her? I'm not surprised. I can't wait to write Susan and tell her, though. Elizabeth grinned. They really are monsters. They always have been. It's hard to believe one of the demon horde could grow up to run her own business. Do all of you have both of the same parents? She couldn't imagine the woman in front of her once being one of the wild children who wreaked such havoc in the local school. Oh, yes, Elizabeth answered. Mother was much better about discipline when there were only 4 of us. It's the younger ones that were spoiled so horribly. I see. Anna didn't really, though. All children were treated the same when they were in an orphanage. She didn't have any experience with having parents, though. I wish I did, Elizabeth said with a laugh. Where will you stay through the summer? I assume you board with a family near the schoolhouse? Anna nodded. I only spend enough money to keep myself clothed adequately. I have money saved, and I'll continue to pay for my room and board until it's time for me to go. She should be able to make herself a new wardrobe as well, but she didn't add that. Being raised to a life of frugality came in very handy when living on a teacher's salary. Good. Elizabeth poured them each a cup of tea and handed a cup and a plate of cookies to Anna. Do you like the family you board with? Anna shrugged. They're fine. I don't really know them well. I spend my time in my bedroom working on lesson plans and grading papers. I help with the dishes and eat meals with them, but that's about it. She knew she should have made more of an effort to get to know the family, but for her it truly was an effort, and she had no desire to work that hard at home. Elizabeth frowned. Have you tried to get to know them? Anna shook her head. I don't do well with strangers, although I seem to be comfortable with you. I'm not certain why. Elizabeth gave Anna a half smile, obviously concerned about her. How will you spend your summer? I'll sew and get things ready for my journey west. I know I'll need more clothes than what I have and a few good aprons. Anna was glad she wouldn't be starting her marriage with children. She didn't need to have that added stress as she got to know a man. She would be scared enough as she was. At least Tom sounded like a good, loving man. Have you thought about meeting someone here at home and not going out west to be a bride? Elizabeth asked. I have a hard time talking to men. I don't know how I'd get to the point of even being courted, let alone married. Anna shook her head. No, I'll take my chances on a stranger. Jesse left Ernie with the housekeeper he'd hired after Deborah's death and walked down to the graveyard to visit his wife. She'd been gone for 3 years, and still, he thought about her every day. She'd been the only woman he'd ever met who'd been worth giving up his freedom for. He'd loved her more than he'd ever thought possible, and since she'd been gone, He only felt as if he were half a man. He sank down onto the grass beside her grave and spoke to her. "Oh, Deborah, I don't know what to do. Ernie is known all around the area as a hellion. He's only 8 and already he's in trouble every day in school. He set the cup of flowers he put on her grave just the day before back up, and picked some of the weeds from her grave. My housekeeper says she's going to quit at the end of the month. She can't handle him any longer. He's been expelled from school 3 different times now. You kept him behaving just the way he should, but I don't think anyone else could do it the way you did." His fingers traced over her name on her tombstone. "My papa died. He left me money, a lot more money than I realized he had. I think I'm going to take that money and go buy a ranch in Texas," he sighed. "You know I've always dreamed of owning a ranch out west, and I found a great opportunity. An older couple is going to sell their ranch, and they're including furniture as well as the cattle. Most of the cowboys will even stay on. I don't know what else to do, and I think we need a fresh start. Of course, that means I won't get to see you anymore, but I'll always love you. I promise. I need to do this for Ernie as much as for me. I wish I could explain just how bad it's gotten, but I don't know how. I'll find a housekeeper out there who doesn't know what he's like, and she'll be able to keep him in line." He stood up, tears filling his dark eyes. "I love you, Deborah. Don't forget it." He made the 15-minute walk home from the graveyard, feeling as if he had his answer. When he told Deborah it was time to move on, he had felt an overwhelming sense of peace come over him, as if she approved of his plans. Yes, moving to Texas was the answer. He hoped he could get Mrs. Jenkins to stay long enough to help him pack everything up. "You have a guest," Mrs. Roper said, moving aside so that Anna could leave her room. It had been 6 weeks since Anna had talked to Elizabeth Miller, and she'd been sewing diligently ever since. Her things were almost ready for her to leave, taking the train to Texas. She'd heard a lot about how wild Texas was, and she was more than a little frightened, but she was getting everything in order so she could leave as soon as she received his letter. She stepped into the small parlor and found Elizabeth waiting for her. Anna smiled. "Hello." She clenched her fists nervously, wondering what news the other woman had brought her. Elizabeth looked at her, beaming. "You received a letter today, so I brought it by." Anna took the letter and sat down beside Elizabeth on the sofa. She carefully opened it and read it. "Dear Anna, you sound like just the bride for me. I'll be waiting for you at the stagecoach here in Wiggyville. I've included train tickets to depart on August 17th, and then there will be a stagecoach to catch once you get to Weatherford, Texas. I know your journey will be long, so I've included some money for food along the way. I look forward to seeing you. We'll marry as soon as you step off the stagecoach. Once you get here, I'm not letting you get away from me." She took the cash and tickets from the letter and gave the bank draft that was included to Elizabeth. "He wants me to leave tomorrow. I don't think I can do that. I'm not ready." She could barely breathe just thinking about leaving the following day. She just couldn't do it. Elizabeth frowned. "Well, we may be able to get the train station to switch your ticket for you, and then we can send a telegram to Tom letting him know that you'll be a little late. When do you think you can go?" Anna thought about it for a moment. It really wasn't about being physically ready to go. She'd done more than enough sewing, and it would only take her an hour to pack up everything she owned. She just needed time to prepare mentally for the journey. 2 weeks? Elizabeth nodded. "I don't think that's excessive." She stood. "I brought my horse and buggy. Why don't we drive into town, and I'll help you switch your ticket and send a telegram to Tom. It shouldn't be a problem." The ticket was exchanged, and they went to the telegraph office. Because she was frugal, and had to pay by the letter, Anna carefully crafted her message. I will be arriving 2 weeks later than scheduled. Stop. I hope you will forgive me for making everyone wait. Stop. Miss Simmons. Stop." Elizabeth nodded in agreement. That should work beautifully. She tucked her arm through Anna's as they walked back to the buggy. "I'll pick you up the morning of the 31st, and drive you to the train station myself. I like to have a talk with everyone before they depart." Anna nodded, relieved. She hadn't looked forward to carrying her trunk into town by herself, and she certainly didn't feel like she could ask Mr. Roper to take her into town. She hated to ask anyone for anything after growing up an orphan. "I'd like that a lot." Elizabeth smiled. "Your train leaves at noon, so I'll be by around 10:30 to make sure we get everything loaded on time, and we make it to the station." "That sounds good. I'll be ready and waiting for you." Anna was thrilled to have the extra 2 weeks to ready herself mentally. She would need every minute of each day. The morning of the 31st was beautiful and sunny. Anna was glad her last day in her hometown of 20 years would be pretty for her. Elizabeth arrived exactly on time and helped Anna load her trunk into the back of the buggy. Anna also carried a small carpet bag with everything she'd need while on the journey. She climbed into the buggy beside Elizabeth, and they talked the entire way into town. "I don't know if I told you the story of how I came to be the owner of the bride agency," Elizabeth began. Anna shook her head. "I told you my sister was a bride who had left Beckham. Harriet Long was the owner back then, and she placed Susan with her husband. A few years later, I came into town one day and happened to overhear that Harriet was leaving town and would be closing the agency." Anna looked at her in surprise. "Closing it? But it's open." "I know. I told her I thought Beckham needed an agency to help women find husbands. I felt like she did a great service. So Harriet invited me to run the business. She taught me everything there was to know about running it, and then she went off to be a mail order bride herself in Seattle. The house is really hers. I don't see her ever coming back for it, but legally, it belongs to her." "I had no idea. I don't know what I thought, but that certainly wasn't it." She admired Elizabeth for being willing to stand up for something she believed in. She'd never had the courage to do that herself. "No, I understand. As part of taking over the business, I promised that I would always have a very important talk with the brides before they left. Never let a man mistreat you. As women, we're in a bad position if we marry a bad man. Men can beat their wives and no one thinks anything of it. Promise me that if you end up in a bad situation, you will let me know. In return, I promise that I will send you a train ticket, and I will let you stay with me until you're back on your feet." Anna thought about it for a moment. She'd never thought about men beating their wives, but she could see that it was a possibility. Finally, she nodded. "I won't stay in a bad situation." Elizabeth smiled and nodded. "That's what I needed to hear. I packed you enough food for today on the train. You'll want to save every dime you can along the way." She stopped in front of the train station, and together they got the trunk out of the buggy. Elizabeth hugged Anna tightly. "I'll wait with you until they call your train, but I want to hug you now. I don't do the crying as I watch people pull out thing. It makes me too sad. I need you to write me as soon as you're settled in Wiggyville. I hope you have a wonderful time there." Anna nodded, shaking a little now that the time to leave was at hand. She'd spend 10 days on a train and then a few hours on a stagecoach. It was going to be a long trip, and she'd never been further from home than an hour out into the country. They waited, side by side, for the train to be called, chatting about different things in town. Elizabeth told some stories about Texas that her sister had sent, and even told her about how her 2 older stepsons had gotten into a fight and rolled around in mud on her wedding day. The stories helped Anna relax and made her laugh. She hadn't had a lot in her life worth laughing about, but she decided then that she would do her best to laugh more. Everyone needed to smile. She would be a joyful wife for Tom, because he sounded like the kind of man that deserved a joyful wife. Chapter 2. Anna felt a moment of panic as she searched for her stagecoach at the train station in Weatherford, Texas. She was so close to the end of her journey, and she just wanted to be there. Yes, she knew she would be marrying a stranger at the end of the journey, but by that point, she was so tired, she didn't even care as long as he had a bed she could sleep in. She found her coach and climbed in, sitting with her hands folded primly in her lap as she stared out the window. She waited for someone else to join her, but there was no one else. She would be alone for the long drive to Wiggyville. She wished that Tom would have arrived to get her at the train station, but she understood that he probably couldn't take the time away from work to meet her there. When they pulled into Wiggyville, Anna looked around the small town. There was a mercantile, a church, a school, several houses, and not much more. She climbed down using the step the driver put down and waited as he took the trunk down from atop the stage. He pulled away before she let herself look around for Tom. He'd said he'd be there waiting for her, but she was slightly worried he hadn't received her telegram. There was no one waiting. No one at all. He wouldn't have just forgotten about her, would he? She could feel her heart beating faster, and her breath was coming too quickly. She was in a state far from home and knew no one. If he didn't come to meet her, she had no idea what she'd do. Anna was starting to panic, tears filling her eyes when a red-headed woman stopped her buggy beside her. "Are you here to meet someone?" the lady asked, her voice soft and sweet. Anna nodded. I'm here to meet my fiancé, Tom Harding. He was supposed to be waiting for me? She hoped the woman in front of her knew Tom and could take her to him. Maybe he'd been injured while working his ranch. Anything could have happened to him. She found she wasn't as worried about Tom as she was about what she'd do if she couldn't find him. Come with me. We'll talk. Anna put her things into the back of the buggy and climbed up to sit beside her. My name is Julia. I'm Anna Simmons. She hated talking to a stranger this way, but she didn't feel like she had a choice. She needed to find her fiancé so she wouldn't be alone here in a strange place. I was Julia Simmons until 2 weeks ago. I'm going to tell you a funny story. Anna nodded, her face skeptical. When I arrived in Wiggyville 2 weeks ago, I was expecting someone from the school board to be waiting for me. A man walked up to me and asked if I was Miss Simmons. I, of course, said I was, and he kissed me. Right there in the middle of the street. I had heard people were friendlier in Texas, but that was a lot friendlier than what I was expecting. I very politely asked him to take me to wherever I was staying. He said that was fine, but he had to make a stop first. His stop was the preacher's house. When I realized he intended to marry me, I tried to explain that I was here to teach school, not to marry him, but every time I protested, he'd just start kissing me again. Before I knew it, I was standing in front of the preacher, and he was pronouncing us husband and wife. And that's how I ended up married to your fiancé. Anna felt her heart drop into her stomach. I can certainly understand how that could have happened. I told him I was certain that once I arrived, I would just try to run back home, so he must have just kept kissing you to keep you from running away. She shrugged. I'm not upset, because he was a stranger to me, but I don't know what I'm supposed to do now. Was there a boarding house in town where she could stay until she found a job? Were there even jobs for women like her? Julia smiled warmly. Well, I think there's only one answer. You go home with me. So what's Tom like? Anna asked, her mind frantically wondering if the solution would work. How could she just move in with her former fiancé and his wife? It just wouldn't be right. They were still newlyweds. Julia grinned. He's a wonderful husband to me. I honestly couldn't ask for a better man. I'm still teaching until another teacher can be found, and he's been very supportive of me throughout it all. Will he mind that you're bringing me home with you? What man would want a stranger living with him and his new wife? No, Tom wouldn't want her there. Julia shook her head. No, of course not. He'll understand that he's the one who stranded you by marrying me, so it's our responsibility to help you. We have a spare room that you can use until you decide what you want to do. Her voice was strong and confident. She seemed determined to take Anna home with her. Anna bit her lip. She didn't have a lot of choices, but she didn't want to take advantage of the other woman's generosity. I guess I really have nowhere to go, do I? We would buy you a ticket back home if you need us to, or there are plenty of unmarried men around. You could stay with us until you found one you were interested in marrying. Or you don't happen to be a certified teacher, do you? Julia asked the question flippantly, but she seemed to really want an answer. Anna looked at her in surprise. I was a teacher before I left home. Why? Does this town need a teacher now? She didn't want to go back to teaching, but it was better than being stuck in a town she didn't know, having to live with people she didn't know. She couldn't think of anything worse than that. At least she'd have her own income. They don't allow married women to teach here, so I'm just working until they find someone to replace me. If you wanted to teach, you would have a place to stay, because there was a family in town who had agreed to let me board there. Anna nodded, reluctant to teach again, but knowing she really didn't have a choice at that point. Could you introduce me to the school board at church on Sunday? If you don't mind, that is. Oh, I don't mind at all. Mr. Hanson will be pleased to have someone interested in the post, because he's very eager to get rid of me. Julia shrugged. He really has a problem with a married woman teaching, but I'm not certain why. I've never really understood why a married woman can't be as good of a teacher as an unmarried woman. I'd think a married woman would be more focused on the students and not thinking nearly as much about who she's going to marry. I'm not certain I understand the reasoning either, but I do know it's a rule in most places. Anna stared at the brown grass that seemed to go on forever. Didn't it ever rain in Texas? How far is it to the ranch? We're almost there. Tom doesn't know you're coming, so be prepared for him to be surprised. He never got your telegram, you know. It went to Mr. Hanson, because you just used initials, and Tom and Mr. Hanson have the same initials. Julia smiled at her. I guess I did everything wrong, didn't I? If I'd gotten on that train the day I was supposed to instead of being too afraid to leave town, none of this ever would have happened. Anna shook her head, disgusted with herself. She should have done as she said she would instead of inventing reasons to wait. Oh, is that why you were late? Julia parked in front of the house and carefully stepped down. If you want to leave your bags, Tom will happily take them in for you when he unhitches the horse. Anna nodded, just taking her small carpet bag inside, but leaving her trunk for Tom to carry. It was the least he could do after marrying someone else, right? She followed Julia inside to the kitchen where the other woman hurriedly began cooking. Anna pulled her apron on so she could do whatever she could to help her. Julia smiled. You don't have to help with supper. Your room is at the top of the stairs. Go ahead and get comfortable. Oh, I love to cook, Anna protested. What are you fixing? She truly preferred cooking to teaching any day of the week. Julia shrugged. I think I'm just going to make stew with some salt pork, and maybe some biscuits to go with it. I'll make the biscuits, Anna offered. She made light, fluffy biscuits that never failed to receive a compliment. She'd love to share her cooking with her new friend. Did you cook a lot for your family? Julia asked as she watched her cook. I was an orphan raised in an orphanage in Beckham, Massachusetts. I helped in the kitchen there a great deal. When I was too old to stay any longer, I became a teacher, but I really didn't enjoy it, so I decided to become a mail-order bride. She stared down at her hands for a moment. I should have fulfilled my obligations and just come instead of deciding to wait longer. She wondered how different her life was going to be because of that one decision. Honestly? I'm glad you waited. I never would have married Tom if you hadn't, and I'm very happy with him. Anna smiled, wondering what this perfect man that Julia kept talking about would be like. Would she find him as fascinating as Julia obviously did? Tom walked into the room then, giving her an odd look as he walked over to kiss Julia. Watching the two of them together, Anna knew she'd done the best thing for everyone concerned. Tom was a large man, and she wanted to immediately cower away from him. She avoided his gaze and kept cooking, looking for an excuse to run up the stairs away from him as soon as she could. After supper she did just that. She took a bath, in a real bathtub for the first time in her life, before disappearing up the stairs. She thanked God that she'd not married Tom, knowing she never could have been happy with him. Julia was meant to be Tom's bride and God must have other plans for her. At church on Sunday morning, Julia went out of her way to introduce Anna to Mr. Hanson, who seemed like a pompous ninny to Anna. So you've taught before? What's your experience? Mr. Hanson was as wide as he was tall, and had a tendency to sweat. He had sweat dripping down his ruddy cheeks, and Anna wanted to take a step back to avoid getting rained on. I taught for 2 years at a small rural school outside of Beckham, Massachusetts. I boarded with a local family while I taught there, Anna replied, watching his face to see his reaction. She'd never imagined she would be interviewed at church. Why couldn't he set up a time to meet with her like a normal person? Mr. Hanson nodded importantly. My wife and I have agreed to board the new teacher, whomever she may be. Our children are out of the house now, but I'm on the school board, and we live just across the street from the schoolhouse. That sounds as if it would work for me. Anna dug into the drawstring purse she had attached to her wrist. I brought my teaching credentials in case you needed to see them. She had packed it thinking it might come in handy, but she truly hoped she'd never have to use her teaching certificate again. This seems to be in order. Yes, absolutely. I'll talk to the others, but I believe we'll be offering you a job. Where are you staying? I'm staying with Julia and Tom Harding. I was supposed to marry Tom, Anna said softly. It felt strange admitting that she was the bride who came too late to marry him, but she held her head up high. Yes, I've heard what happened there. It's why I'm looking for a new teacher. He shook his head. I hope your morals are stronger than the last teacher we hired. We will offer you $40 a month for teaching, minus $10 a month for room and board. Would that be acceptable should we offer you the position? That sounds more than fair. Anna wanted to kick him for the way he talked about Julia, but what could she really do? The man held her future in the palm of his hand. Julia shook her head as Mr. Hanson walked off to go speak with the other members of the school board. He makes me so angry. It's like he doesn't have the ability to remember what it's like to meet someone and be attracted to them. Anna smiled. Don't listen to him. He's just trying to do his job, even if he's going about it in a very odd way. She didn't believe a single word she said, of course, but she would be polite if it killed her. Oh, I know. I'm working hard to make certain the children are taught well, even though he makes me angry. I'm honestly looking forward to the day when I can be a full-time wife. Teaching here is not what I imagined teaching would be. Anna patted Julia's arm. Nothing is ever exactly what you think it will be. I had Tom all built up in my head to be an almost godlike man. I get here, and he's just like every other man I've ever met. She was so relieved that she hadn't married him. Teaching was preferable to marrying a man who intimidated her so much. Julia laughed. I had never heard of him, but I think he's pretty wonderful. I guess it's all in the eye of the beholder, isn't it? Mr. Hanson came back then, interrupting their giggles. The school board has voted to offer you the position. You may start tomorrow. Tomorrow? That soon? But Anna wasn't sure she could be ready to start that quickly. She needed to ready herself mentally to take over the schoolroom. Is there a problem with that, Miss Simmons? Mr. Hanson raised an eyebrow as if just waiting for her to argue with him. No, sir. Anna looked at Julia, hoping her friend would help her get ready for the task ahead of her. We'll get you packed and take you to Mr. Hanson's house this evening, Anna. It's no problem. Julia squeezed Anna's hand, obviously trying to give her some courage for the job. I should think not. It's going to be hard enough for those children to have to switch teachers midterm. We'll make the transition as smooth as possible. He looked at Julia. You'll be paid for the half month you worked. Good day. Anna couldn't believe how rude the man had been. She wasn't looking forward to staying with him at all. What if he treated his wife that way? She would be morally obligated to hit him over the head with a frying pan. She wasn't certain she'd be able to stop herself. Jesse was exhausted by the time he and Ernie finally reached Wiggyville, Texas. It was an odd name for a town, but he hoped the place would be just what Ernie needed to settle down and start acting like he should. One of the first things he did on Saturday morning was go to the Mercantile with Ernie in tow. Do you happen to know of any women looking for work? Maybe a widow who's a good cook and enjoys cleaning, but her family has moved on? He said a quick prayer that there would be someone meeting his description. There was no way he could run a ranch, cook, clean, and run herd on Ernie. He needed someone to help him fast. The owner shook his head. Out here when a man dies, another man marries his lady within a week or two. We don't have any single women, except the school teacher, of course, but she ain't allowed to marry. Jesse nodded tiredly as he bought the supplies they needed. So there's a school? That was A+. He would have somewhere to send Ernie during the week. Oh, yes. Miss Simmons is the teacher, and she's a pretty little thing. Never talks above a whisper far as I can tell, but she's a good teacher. Jesse looked down at Ernie. You hear that? You'll be starting school on Monday. It would be easy to have him start school in a new place where no one knew of his mischief. Jesse was relieved to hear the town had a school. He'd heard that many didn't out west. I don't want to go to school, Pa. I want to stay home with you and help on the ranch. The Mercantile owner's eyes perked up. You buy the old Kyle ranch? Jesse nodded. I did. I start work first thing Monday morning. He wished he had the energy to start immediately, because the place really needed it, but he didn't. He had to take the weekend to rest. Besides, the preacher had already invited him to dinner on Sunday night. He was looking forward to going. It's a good spread. Shocked us all when Kyle announced he was retiring and moving back east. The man continually wiped the same spot on his counter until Jesse wanted to warn him he was going to wipe a hole right through it. What was it about Mercantile owners and wiping the same spot all day? I was happy to be able to buy it. All the hands are being kind enough to stay, so I'll be able to learn easy. He knew he probably shouldn't admit that he was new at owning a ranch, but he'd done enough reading about it. He was certain he wouldn't make any really stupid mistakes. At least he hoped he wouldn't. What about your wife? How's she feel about moving to Texas to be a rancher's wife? Jesse shook his head. My wife died 3 years back. It's just Ernie and me. He didn't want to elaborate, so he paid for his goods and left, wondering how he was going to be able to cook enough to keep either of them alive. At least the Mercantile sold some bread. He could do something with that. Probably. Settling into the Hansen home was easier than Anna had anticipated. Her room was small, but it had everything she needed, and she could easily go in it and shut the door, closing out the Hansen family. She helped Mrs. Hansen with the dishes after each meal, and when Mrs. Hansen wanted help, Anna would help her cook as well. She certainly didn't mind being in the kitchen, but when Mr. Hansen was around, she went to her room and closed him out. He hadn't been nearly as rude to her as he had been to her friend, Julia, but she wasn't going to do anything to get him to be rude. It obviously didn't take much. School was remarkably easy compared to teaching in Beckham. She still didn't enjoy being a teacher, but without the demon horde attending her school, there were no discipline problems and just students working all day every day. This was what she'd imagined teaching would be, and she wasn't dissatisfied with the turn of events that had brought her back to the classroom. Teaching was fine as long as she wasn't teaching a classroom full of little demon spawn. She'd been teaching for 2 weeks without a single incident, and she was starting to relax a bit, feeling more comfortable with the task in front of her. She was actually looking forward to school Monday morning, and ate her breakfast as quickly as she could without Mr. Hansen making a comment about it. She wiped the dishes dry for Mrs. Hansen, and the two of them spoke in hushed tones as they worked. For some reason, Mr. Hansen thought it was unseemly for women to enjoy housework, and he didn't like them to talk loudly or laugh while they worked. Apparently in his mind, women shouldn't ever do anything they enjoyed. Anna was comfortable enough with Mrs. Hansen that they often enjoyed their housework when they knew Mr. Hansen was out of the house. Anna wondered how the sweet woman could deal with her husband, but she knew better than to ask. Mrs. Hansen seemed to all but worship Mr. Hansen, and she wasn't about to try and get in the way of marital bliss. When she finished with the dishes, Anna hurried to her room to get her things for school, taking the lunch pail that Mrs. Hansen provided for her every morning. "I'll see you this afternoon, Mrs. Hansen." "Have a good day, dear." Anna rushed out the door, glad to be away from the house where she felt so oppressed. She walked slowly to the schoolyard, looking forward to another week. The children were all so well behaved, she felt like she should send a thank you note to each of their parents for teaching them manners. She swept out the schoolroom as she did each morning, and was sitting at her desk reading a good book when the children started coming. She would look up and smile or call a greeting as each one put their things on their desk and ran outside to go to play until she called them. A young boy, no more than 8, that she hadn't seen before came into the schoolhouse and looked around at the empty seats. Anna stood up. "Are you new here?" "I'm Miss Simmons." She pointed to an empty desk. "That's a good place for you to sit. What's your name?" She was excited at the prospect of a new student, which told her this teaching job really was where she was meant to be. The boy looked at her, his eyes filled with orneriness. She knew the look well, because every child of the demon horde had that same look every day. "I'm Ernie Hoover. My pa and me just moved here on Saturday." "Just you and your pa?" she asked, wanting to know about his mother. "Ma's dead." He said nothing else as he dumped his things on his desk and hurried out to the schoolyard. Anna sighed. Her sweet 2 weeks of teaching a well-behaved class were over. She had a hellion, and she was going to have to deal with behavioral issues again. She shook her head. "At least there aren't 6 of them, right?" Walking out to the schoolyard, she called the children into class, and they all came running and skipping, many of them already out of breath. Laughter rang through the building, and Anna couldn't help but smile. She didn't like teaching a great deal, but she loved children. Having the chance to interact with them every day made her days better. She sat down and carefully added Ernie's name to her roster, asking him to come forward for a moment. "You've been to school before?" she asked softly. Not every child had the opportunity to go to school, but she assumed he had by the look on his face that told her he was an experienced mischief maker. He nodded sullenly, refusing to even look at her. "Yep." Anna took a deep breath, knowing that he was being deliberately rude. Most of the children would only respond with, "Yes, ma'am." "Would you mind showing me where you are in your reader and in arithmetic? I need to know what class to put you in." Ernie stomped back to his desk and got his books. He showed her a spot in his reader, his eyes daring her to say something about how little he'd accomplished in it. He was further along with his arithmetic. Anna smiled and nodded. "Thank you, Ernie. You'll be in the 2nd reading group but the 3rd arithmetic group. Please come forward when your classes are called." She wasn't looking forward to the problems he'd cause, But she was determined to treat him just like any other student until he started misbehaving. Ernie returned to his seat, plopped his books on his desk, and promptly slouched down in his seat, making it clear he didn't want to be there. Anna sighed. He was going to be a difficult boy. He was showing all the signs already. Ernie was just what she needed to make her school year complete. By the end of the week, Ernie had started a fistfight, blocked a younger student into the outhouse so they couldn't get out, came in late after lunch every day, refused to study, and basically tried to make her life as difficult as humanly possible. She didn't like to have to use the ruler on children's hands, because she found that it interrupted everyone's learning, and that wasn't fair to anyone else. On Friday afternoon of Ernie's first week in school, she penned a note, working hard to be polite. "Dear Mr. Hoover, I would like you to come in after school on Monday to discuss your son's behavior in my classroom. He's been quite disruptive, and I believe we need to work together to make certain we have a plan for the future. Thank you, and I look forward to meeting you. Sincerely, Miss Simmons." There. Very polite and straight to the point. If that didn't bring the man running, nothing would. After school on Monday, Anna erased the blackboard as she did every day after school, preparing to write out the next day's tasks for the students. She found if she had everything written out when they arrived at the beginning of the day, they had an easier day with no one asking what to do next. She was expecting Mr. Hoover any moment, and she was nervous, like she always was when she had to meet a new man. She knew he'd been at church the previous day, because she'd seen Ernie running around outside with the other children, but she hadn't noticed who he was with. She hadn't been there long enough to be able to know which child belonged to which parent. She heard footsteps behind her and she turned around, looking to see who was there. A man, of medium height and build, with dark hair and brown eyes the color of chocolate, stood at the back of the school with his hand clamped firmly on Ernie's shoulder. Her heart skipped a beat as soon as she saw him, and she wondered why she was more nervous around this man than usual. She was usually nervous enough. She walked toward the back of the room, swallowing hard, because she always had a hard time talking to men, and she was certain this man would be no exception. Once she reached the back of the room, she looked down at Ernie, who was squirming under his father's hand. "Go on out to the schoolyard, Ernie. I need to speak with your father privately." She gave him a half smile of encouragement, assuming he was nervous about her speaking privately with his father. Ernie looked at his father and stuck his tongue out at Anna, before running from the room. Anna waited for Mr. Hoover to say something to correct the boy, but when he didn't, she wanted to scream. "Do you always let him get away with disrespectful behavior, Mr. Hoover? No wonder he misbehaves so badly in school if you don't discipline him." Mr. Hoover raised an eyebrow before sticking his thumbs through the belt loops of his work pants and looking her up and down. How dare this little mouse think she had the right to tell him how to raise his child? "Do you always let your students treat you disrespectfully and expect their parents to fix the problem? I assure you, Miss Simmons, I don't have time to sit in your classroom all day and do your job." Anna had never been so angry with a man in her entire life, not even Mr. Hanson. Usually, she would be afraid to react to the criticism, but she was furious, and her shyness flew out the window. She took a step toward him, her tiny stature still having to look way up to him despite that fact that he wasn't any taller than average. If you were doing your job and raising the boy right in the first place, he wouldn't dare to think of being disrespectful in my classroom. Who do you think you are to tell me I'm not raising my boy right? He took one more step forward, and the two of them were all but brushing their bodies up against one another as they faced each other. He could see the pores on her nose and the flecks of green in her otherwise sky-blue eyes. "Are you telling me that you don't think you should have to teach your boy to behave correctly in the first place, and it's my job to both parent and teach him?" As soon as the words were out of her mouth, she knew she'd gone too far, but she couldn't take them back. She bit her lip, waiting to see what the man would say or do. Jesse Hoover's eyes flashed as he stared down at the tiny little spitfire of a teacher. He knew Ernie was trouble. He had been ever since his mother had died, but it wasn't Jesse's job to deal with him while Ernie was at school. He was only 8. What kind of teacher couldn't deal with an 8-year-old boy? "Don't you have a ruler you can use on his knuckles?" He hated the idea of anyone hitting his son, but he knew that was the normal discipline in schoolrooms. He'd had a ruler used on his own knuckles more times than he could count. Anna couldn't believe her ears. If he was disciplined properly at home, I wouldn't have to resort to corporal punishment in my classroom. If I have to get the ruler out, then I will have to disrupt the entire class to use it. If you will just discipline him at home and make it clear that you will back up whatever I say, then we won't have any more issues." Jesse was so angry he wanted to hit the woman. He stared down into her pretty face and realized hitting her wasn't what he wanted to do. He wanted to kiss her. He grabbed her by the waist and pulled her to him, his mouth crushing hers with a hard kiss, his tongue immediately demanding entrance. Anna stood paralyzed for a moment, not believing this man was actually touching her. Didn't he know she was his son's teacher? It only took a moment for her to feel her stomach fill with longing. She put her hands up to his shoulders to push him away, and instead, she grasped them and clung to him. Her mind was no longer functioning. What was he doing to her? After a moment, Jesse lifted his head, staring down at the pretty little teacher. Her hair was coming down from the sides of her bun, where it had been pinned up severely. Her lips, a bright pink and moist from his kiss, were still parted, and she was panting slightly. She was a teacher? She looked like she should be a dancer in the local saloon. Not her clothes, of course, but the wanton look on her face. He stared at her for a moment, waiting for her to open her eyes and realize exactly what she was doing. Anna blinked a few times, returning to reality. Instead of agreeing to discipline his child properly, he had kissed her instead. She had never been kissed before, and the first time she was, it was by a man whose first name she didn't even know. What was wrong with her? She took a step back, just as she saw the pink fabric of the skirt of a dress disappear around the corner. Oh blast. Someone just saw that. I'm going to lose my job. She folded her arms across her chest for a moment, glaring at him, waiting for him to tell her that it would be all right. Jesse's eyes widened. Why would he care if she lost her job? If she couldn't control Ernie, then she was obviously a terrible teacher anyway. I guess you shouldn't be going around kissing your students' fathers instead of working then, should you? Anna clenched her fists, not believing this man was really blaming her for the kiss he initiated. I trust that you'll talk to Ernie and get his behavior under control so that I don't have to expel him. Good day, Mr. Hoover. She turned and walked regally to her desk on the raised platform at the front of the room, and sank into her chair. He had to leave so she could think. Her mind was racing in 100 different directions at once. Why had he kissed her? And more importantly, why had she liked it? Who had seen her, and would they tell? What would she do if she lost her job? She wanted to bury her face in her hands and have a good cry, but she couldn't with him standing there staring at her. He couldn't believe she was such a little snob, and he wasn't going to deal with her any longer. His son was fine. He was just a boy. That woman was just going to have to learn how to deal with boys. Where had they found her anyway? Didn't they want women who knew how to work with children to teach? Once in the schoolyard, he grabbed Ernie's hand and started toward home. Just as he left the schoolyard, he heard himself say, "When we get home, I'm going to take a belt to your bottom like I should have done years ago, boy. You will not show that kind of disrespect to anyone, but most especially your teacher." He had no clue where the words had come from, but once they were out, he almost smiled. Yes, Ernie needed to be taken in hand. He'd never tell that little spitfire of a teacher he agreed with her, though. No way. Chapter 3. Anna was nervous all through dinner, wondering what Mr. Hanson would say if he heard about her kissing Mr. Hoover. She wanted to kick herself. She still didn't know the man's first name, but she'd replayed that kiss in her mind a dozen times. What was it about him that made her want to kiss him, when she thwarted the attentions of several other men in her life? When nothing happened before bed, she breathed a little more evenly, no longer as worried. The week went by terribly slowly for her as she watched over her shoulder for someone to come and fire her at any moment. She spent a lot of time trying to figure out whose pink skirt she'd seen Monday afternoon, but she had no idea. Was it a small child who would tell her parents? Was it an older girl who would come to her? She had no idea. What would she do if she couldn't hold down the job? Mr. Hanson would have no problem kicking her out of his house into the street. She could always try to marry, but every time she met a man she was paralyzed with fear. Well, every time she met one except Mr. Hoover. What had come over her anyway? She still couldn't figure out why she'd kissed the man as she had. Ernie was better behaved than he had been, seeming to think before he acted out in class, which thrilled Anna. Maybe his father had realized how ridiculous he was being and decided to talk to him after all. She was feeling much better about her position by the time Saturday morning rolled around. If no one had said anything yet, Surely they wouldn't. She was in her room grading papers when there was a loud knock on her door. "Miss Simmons, you need to come into the parlor right now." Mr. Hansen's voice sounded even angrier than it usually did. Anna's eyes widened. Was this it? Had whoever had seen them finally told what they'd seen? She jumped up from her chair at the vanity she was using as a desk and hurriedly fixed her hair, before walking into the parlor. She forced herself to take deep breaths the whole way, worried that she would embarrass herself. When she arrived, she saw one of her students, Susie, who was only 6, standing in front of a man who was seated on the sofa. He was a big bear of a man and Anna wanted to hide behind the piano. Mr. Hansen captured her attention then, speaking in a softer, kinder voice than she'd ever heard from him. "Susie, why don't you tell us all what you saw on Monday afternoon?" Anna's heart sank. This was it. She was about to be fired, and she had no idea what she would do when that happened. Susie looked at Anna, her eyes filled with tears, and she told her story, her lisp more pronounced than usual. "I thought them pretty flowers on my way home from school, and I thought they were though pretty, that I wanted to take them to meet them and I picked a whole bouquet. When I got back to the school, I thought meet them and kissing a man I'd never seen before, right there in the classroom." She was crying loudly by the end of her little speech. "I'm 30, meet them and..." Anna smiled kindly at the little girl. "You have nothing to be sorry for, Susie." And she didn't. Anna was the one who'd made a mistake, not the sweet little girl with the blonde pigtails standing in front of her. "What do you have to say for yourself, Miss Simmons?" Mr. Hansen's voice was as mean as she'd ever heard it once it was directed on her. Anna straightened her back. "I don't know what I can say. A man grabbed me and kissed me, and Susie happened along just then." She didn't add that she'd enjoyed the kiss, but she didn't think that Mr. Hansen really cared what had happened anyway. He wanted to punish her, and he would. Mr. Hansen took a deep breath. "So you're trying to tell me a man you'd never met walked into the schoolhouse and grabbed you and kissed you without you inviting him to?" Anna thought carefully about his words, not wanting to lie. "Yes, that's exactly what I'm telling you." Mr. Hansen glared at her. "You are dismissed from your position, Miss Simmons. You have until the sundown tonight to retrieve your belongings from my home and to get anything you may have left at the schoolhouse. Good day." He turned and left the room then, obviously not caring that he left a little girl and her father as well as Anna in the room. Susie was sobbing by that point, seemingly over guilt at having told what she'd seen. Anna knew her first priority needed to be to the child. She dropped to one knee and opened her arms, and Susie flew into them. "I'm no 30, meet them and..." "I know, Susie. I know. No one is angry with you." Anna realized as soon as the words were out of her mouth that they were true. She wasn't angry with Susie. She was angry with Mr. Hoover for kissing her in the first place, because she hadn't asked to be kissed, but she wasn't mad at Susie. When Susie had quieted, Anna stood up. She looked at Susie's father, who had been quiet through everything that happened. "I'm terribly sorry this happened, Mr. Johnston." Mr. Johnston shook his head sadly. "All I really wanted was for him to tell you it was inappropriate for you to be kissing in the schoolroom where any of the children could walk in on you. I had no idea he'd fire you." Anna smiled ruefully. "I knew as soon as I realized someone had seen me that this would be the result if it came to Mr. Hansen's attention." She shrugged. "I guess I need to figure out what to do next." She had some money saved, but not nearly enough. "Is there a boarding house in town by any chance?" "No, ma'am. Wiggyville doesn't have anything as fancy as that." "I was afraid you'd say that." She rubbed the back of her neck. "I think I'll walk over to the Mercantile and see if there are any job postings there." They followed her to the door. "I look forward to seeing you at church tomorrow," she told Susie. Susie smiled at her, putting her hand in hers. "I'm glad you're not mad at me." "Why would I be angry with you? You did nothing wrong," Anna said. Anna watched the two walk off down the street toward the farm Anna knew they had just outside of town. She walked the other way down the street toward the Mercantile. Surely there was some type of bulletin board there like there was back in Beckham. She entered the store and waved to the owner of the Mercantile, Mr. Stemmons. She'd seen him at church several times, so she felt as if she knew him. She walked to the back of the store where he was working. "Do you have a help wanted bulletin board here?" Her voice was soft, as it always was when talking to someone she didn't know well, but she was proud that she was able to get the words out. "Well, I have one, but it's just for people looking for cowboys and such. You looking for work? He eyed her skeptically, obviously wondering why the teacher would be looking for work in the middle of the school year. She blushed, nodding. She didn't want to admit she'd been fired, but she knew it would be all over town in a minute. I am. Do you know of anyone? He nodded. Actually, I do. There was someone in town looking for a housekeeper just the other day. Do you know where it was? She didn't want to get too excited about the prospect, because someone could have been hired, but the idea of working there was more than she'd had an hour ago. Sure. They live out at the old Kyle Ranch. Just take the road heading west, and walk for about a mile. It'll be the first house you come to once you're out of town on the left side of the road. Anna nodded, happy that there was at least a possibility of her getting a job. She needed to have something lined up before the end of the day. She knew she could always go begging to Julia again, but she didn't want to do that. She'd rather find something without her friend's help. Thank you, Mr. Stemmons. Anytime. He watched her leave his store and walk toward the west with a bemused look on his face. If he were 20 years younger, and unmarried, he'd be chasing after her himself. Why didn't she just pick a man and marry him? Anna looked around her at the now green grass as she walked toward the old Kyle Ranch. When she'd first arrived, everything had been brown from drought. It was amazing what a transformation a few weeks could make. She enjoyed her walk, even though she was fretting about a new job, because she had time to think. She was glad she wouldn't have to deal with Mr. Hoover any longer. Her experiences with him had been more than she could handle anyway. When she got to the ranch, she saw a cowboy, getting off of his horse and putting it into the stable. She walked up to him, barely able to raise her face to mumble, "Is the owner of the ranch around?" The cowboy nodded. "Out behind the house fixin' fences. You want me to take you to him?" "Yes, please," she whispered. She hated being around men she didn't know. Mr. Stemmons was easy, because she talked to him frequently at church, and he'd always been kind to her, but this man made her feel almost paralyzed with fear. The man nodded, studying her closely. "You got business with him?" She nodded. "I'm inquiring about the housekeeper position." "Oh. Yeah, he needs a housekeeper bad." He started walking in the direction of the house, and she followed along behind him. "How long you been in Wiggyville?" he asked, obviously trying to put her at ease. "Just a month." "A month? How come I ain't met you yet?" "I've been teaching here." "Do you go to church?" "I've been there every Sunday." "You're the teacher?" "I've heard some stories about you." The man sounded like he was trying to withhold a laugh. She wasn't about to ask. He stopped walking, and she looked up, noticing immediately a man with dark hair and broad shoulders bent over a fence with a tool in his hand. She did notice his bottom as well, but she didn't mean to. He was a very sexy-looking man. "Hey, Gus? There's a lady here, wanting to talk about being a housekeeper for ya." Jesse smiled. He had given up on the idea of hiring a woman to cook and clean for him, and he knew that he was desperate. Why, he'd even thought of sending off for a mail-order bride, just so he'd have someone to cook and clean for him. He turned, the smile fading from his lips when he saw Miss Simmons standing in front of him. "What are you doing here?" He didn't want to even talk to her, especially if there was a woman there willing to be his housekeeper. Anna frowned. "I could ask you the same thing." She folded her arms over her chest. "I can't work for you. You're not married, and it wouldn't be proper at all." Why hadn't she thought to ask the name of the man needing a housekeeper before she'd walked all the way from town? "Why would I hire a little spitfire like you? I need someone who knows how to cook and clean, not a little hoity-toity school teacher." He looked her up and down as if he didn't think she had any idea how to work. "I know how to cook and clean. I'm very good at it, actually. I just can't work for an unmarried man. It wouldn't be proper. Even if he is the one who got me fired from my job." He grinned, looking like he was trying not to laugh. "How'd I get you fired?" "I didn't do anything." Why would she blame him for whatever had gotten her fired? From what he'd seen, she was always flying off the handle about something. How could it be his fault? She was so angry with him, she couldn't see straight. She forgot all about having an audience and walked closer to him until she was all but standing on his feet. "You're the one who grabbed me and kissed me in the schoolhouse. Did you forget we were seen?" His eyes widened. He had forgotten. She was without a job and it was his fault. Well, you shouldn't have let me kiss you then, should you? He was just being belligerent by saying the words, knowing he was going to have to help her find a solution. She was so angry she couldn't contain it another minute. She kicked him. She'd never done anything violent in her life, but she kicked him as hard as she could, and it felt so good, she did it again. I hate you. You come here with your disobedient, out-of-control child, walk into my school and kiss me, getting me fired. Now I'm in a strange place, where I know no one. What am I supposed to do? You've cost me my job and lost me my place to live. He looked at her, feeling more attracted to her than he had at any woman since Deborah's death. I can't hire you. You're right, it wouldn't be proper. He looked over and realized one of his cowboys was watching their exchange. He waved him away. Get out of here. This is private. Anna took an immediate step back. You're not going to try to kiss me again, are you? Her heart was already beating faster, just at the idea. She hated herself for liking the idea as much as she did. He shook his head, but waited for the cowboy to get out of range. Look, I do feel responsible for you losing your job. I can't hire you because people would talk. He took a deep breath, wondering if he was doing the right thing, but having no idea what else he could possibly do. How about marrying me instead? She stared at him in shock. Had he really just offered to marry her? They'd only met once before. I don't know how to even answer that, Mr. Hoover. You're a stranger to me. A stranger that she enjoyed kissing. I'm not asking you to share my bed. It would be a business arrangement. I'm not ready for a real wife, but I do need someone who can cook and clean for me, and I need help with Ernie. You do everything a wife does except share a room with me. The house is big. There are plenty of bedrooms. You just pick one and it would be yours. So you're asking me to be your housekeeper, and help you raise your son, but with the cloak of marriage to protect my reputation? It truly wasn't a bad idea if they could keep from killing one another, and keep their hands off each other, of course. He nodded. Yeah, that's pretty much it. She thought about it for a moment. It's pretty much what she thought she'd be getting with Tom, but she wouldn't have to share his bed. What happens if one of us falls in love with someone else? He shrugged. I have no idea what we'd do then. I really don't. We'll both have to try not to let that happen, and if it does, we'll cross that bridge when we come to it. He knew he wasn't endearing himself to her with his answer, but he didn't know what else to tell her. She sighed. She wanted to know she'd have security, but this sounded like the best offer she'd get. Being a wife without the bedroom duties sounded wonderful to her. She stepped toward him and held out her right hand to shake. I'll do it. He grinned, happy with her agreement. He didn't realize he'd been holding his breath until she agreed. His hand swallowed hers as he shook it. He felt a rush of electricity shoot through him as soon as he touched her, but he ignored it. He didn't have feelings like that for women any longer. He'd married Deborah, and he'd promised to be true to her. He would still be true to her. I guess we could get married next Saturday? He suggested. She frowned. I have to have everything cleared out of the house where I live today. I've not only lost my job, but I've lost my home. He shrugged. Well, let's hope the preacher is around to marry us then. He strode toward the house, planning on finding Ernie and heading into town. It was the only right thing to do after all. Chapter 4. Anna followed along behind Mr. Hoover, not certain where he was going, but refusing to go into the house with him, because it wouldn't be proper with them both being unmarried and no chaperone around. She stayed on the front porch, sitting in a porch swing that was there. She knew it must be from the previous owners because Mr. Hoover didn't seem like the porch swing type to her at all. A porch swing was more of a finishing touch on a house than something a man would do. It was comfortable though, and she liked the idea of doing some mending on the porch when it was cool outside. It was October, and she still found the weather much too hot for her tastes. Didn't it ever cool off in Texas? She frowned. She still didn't know the man's first name. He kissed her, and she was about to marry him, but she didn't know his name? What was wrong with her? He came out of the house a moment later with Ernie in tow. Ernie glared at her. You're not my mother. She stood up, looking at the boy. I never said I was, but I will do my best to feed you and make sure you wear proper clothes and act right. What else could she say? She knew he didn't want a new mother, but she was stepping into that role, and he was going to respect her. Ernie was obviously upset at the prospect of her marrying his father, but he said nothing more, just looking down at his feet. Mr. Hoover looked at her. "You ready? Let's get this over with." He gestured to the swing. "Wait here while I hitch up the horses." Jesse strode off to the stable, wondering if he could possibly be doing the right thing. He needed to get some help with his son, but was marrying the right way to do it? And he was attracted to her, whether he wanted to be or not. He didn't need her to constantly be around. What was he thinking marrying again anyway? And her? She was the last woman he should marry. He took a deep breath to calm himself, realizing Ernie was standing there looking at him. "Son, I'm not marrying her because I love her. I made her lose her job. I'm giving her another one." He wasn't certain if the words were for her benefit, his or Ernie's. Ernie nodded solemnly. "But, you still only love Ma, right?" Jesse nodded emphatically. "I still only love your Ma." He made quick work of hitching up the team and drove to the house. He drove what was obviously his farm wagon, but she didn't ask if he had a buggy. She needed this marriage to be respectable but still have a place to live and work to do. She knew better than to antagonize him at that point. She climbed into the wagon without help, because he didn't offer any, and sat as far from him on the seat as the buckboard allowed. They didn't speak as they drove into town, stopping in front of a small house. The three of them went to the door, and it was answered by a short middle-aged man with silver streaking his brown hair and dancing blue eyes. He smiled at Anna. "Miss Simmons. I wasn't aware you were acquainted with Mr. Hoover." Anna bit back the unfortunately that danced on the tip of her tongue. She was surprised to know that Mr. Hoover had taken the time to get to introduce himself to the preacher. He didn't seem the type to care much about his spiritual health. "Yes, we want to be married." The preacher nodded solemnly. "Of course." He took their wanting to marry in stride. "Come right in." Anna followed him into the house, knowing the other two would follow quickly behind. "Thank you for taking your time to see us today." She didn't expect Mr. Hoover to be polite, so she thought she should be to make up for him. The pastor turned around in the center of the room and looked at them both. "I'm afraid you're both new enough in town that I only know your last names." He looked at Anna. "Your Christian name is?" "Anna," she whispered. She wished he would hurry and just get it over with. As a child she dreamed of what her wedding would be like, as most girls did, and this was not it. She wanted it over and done with so she could get away from people and just cry. "I'm Jesse," Mr. Hoover said, his voice deep and strong. The pastor nodded. "All right. If you will join hands." Anna froze for a moment before offering her hand to Jesse. She had to learn to think of him as Jesse and not Mr. Hoover. He would be her husband. She couldn't refer to him formally forever. The ceremony was short and sweet. When he pronounced them man and wife and told Jesse to kiss his bride, Anna felt a moment of panic. She turned to him, raising her lips to his, her eyes searching his face. He leaned down and brushed a quick soft kiss just beside her lips, not touching hers with his own. What was wrong with him? She was fine to kiss when she was some random stranger in the schoolhouse, but when she was his wife, he couldn't kiss her. What kind of man had she married? Jesse straightened up, nodding his thanks to the Reverend. "Thank you, Pastor. We appreciate your time." He took Ernie's hand and headed for the door, leaving Anna to trail behind them in his wake. Anna looked at the preacher for a moment, befuddled, before she half ran after the Hoovers. "We have to stop at the Hansons' house to get my things," she reminded him. Mr. Hoover was the type to burn all her things if she hadn't picked them up by the time he'd specified. "You'll have to tell me where that is. I'm afraid I know where the church is, the mercantile, and the pastor's house. Everything else I need directions to." He hated to admit not knowing where something was, but he was new enough in town that he figured she'd understand. In another month, the excuse wouldn't be good enough, and he'd have to know how to do everything. She directed him the short distance down the street to Mr. Hanson's house, before jumping down. "I'll be right back." She was surprised when Jesse jumped down as well. "I'll get your things for you." He followed behind her, leaving Ernie in the wagon as they stepped inside the house. "Mrs. Hanson?" she called. "I'm here to get my things." She didn't want the older woman to be frightened if she was home alone. She genuinely liked Mrs. Hanson and wished she knew how to get her out of her marriage, but Mrs. Hanson seemed happy enough. Mr. Hanson came out of his study and glared at her and Jesse. "So is this the man you were whoring with in the schoolhouse?" he asked. His face was flushed with his anger, and he stood with his hands on his hips as if daring her to deny it. Anna blushed, rushing to her room and ignoring him. She was so thankful not to have to live under the odious old man's roof any longer. She heard, "Well? Are you the one she was kissing?" The word kissing sounded like a cardinal sin coming out of Mr. Hansen's mouth. "Yes, I am. She's a beautiful girl. You can't blame me for kissing her." Jessie looked Mr. Hansen up and down. "I'm sure you've kissed at least one pretty girl in your life." He wasn't about to let the man insult his wife, whether he had feelings for her or not. "I can and I will. I can't believe you had the gall to try and kiss her right there in the schoolhouse. I can't believe you'd fire a woman and turn her out into the street before hearing the entire story. I kissed her in the schoolhouse. She had nothing to do with it." Jessie wasn't worried about the half-truth, because he knew Anna would never have initiated the kiss. She hadn't fought him off, though. He knew for a fact she'd enjoyed it just as much as he had. He forced his mind to stop thinking about that kiss. Now that she was his wife, it seemed to be all he could think about. How soft she'd been in his arms when he'd held her. How sweet her lips had been beneath his own. She should have had the morals to slap your face and walk away. Instead, she let you kiss her. She has no right to be a moral guide for the children in our community. Jessie snorted. "You're an old bigot. I'm glad she's got somewhere better to go now." He'd never met anyone he disliked on first meeting quite as much as he did Mr. Hansen. Burying a fist in his face seemed like a wonderful idea just then, but he didn't want to upset Anna more than this visit already would. "Did you marry the Jezebel?" "Yes, I did, and if I ever hear you talk about my wife that way again, I will personally hunt you down like the weasel you are." He strode off in the direction Anna had disappeared to and stuck his head in the only open door. "You ready, sweetheart?" Anna's eyes danced as they met his. "Sweetheart?" she mouthed. At his shrug, she pointed to her trunk and picked up her carpet bag. "It's right there, darling." She'd heard the entire exchange between the two men and couldn't believe Jessie had come so readily to her defense. He raised an eyebrow but said nothing as he hefted her trunk over one shoulder and led the way out of the house, hoping she'd follow closely behind him and not say anything else to that odious man. Anna stopped at the door. "I hope you find a new teacher quickly." Mr. Hansen stood sputtering for a moment before yelling after her, "I will. And her last name won't be Simmons." Anna ignored him as Jessie put his hands at her waist and gently lifted her into the wagon, carefully tucking her skirts around her like he was infatuated with her. As soon as they were away from the house, she looked at him. "Thank you for standing up for me," he nodded. "I may not be in love with you, but you're still my wife, and no man needs to be talking badly about you." He gave her a funny look. What did he mean by the next teacher not being named Simmons? She laughed softly. "This is a crazy story, but the woman who came out here to teach and ended up married to my fiancé had the same last name as me. That's how the confusion happened." He shook his head. "That's crazy." She smiled as she looked out the other side of the wagon. He may not know it yet, but he was going to make her a very good husband. They drove home in silence, and when they reached the ranch, he carried her trunk inside, leaving her to get down herself. "I'll be back at 5 for supper. Have it waiting for me." He walked off without looking back even once. So that was how it was going to be. He'd do his job, and she'd do hers, and they would have as little contact as possible. She could handle that. Anna watched him go, her stomach growling loudly to remind her she hadn't even had lunch yet. She looked down at Ernie, who didn't look at all pleased to have her in his home. "Did you eat lunch?" "I'm hungry." Ernie shook his head. "No. You came around lunchtime." He eyed her warily, as if he wasn't certain what to think of her being in his house. "I didn't I?" She walked toward the large kitchen at the back of the big ranch house. "Let's see what we can find to eat that doesn't need to be cooked for hours." She ended up making them each a bacon sandwich on toast, while she cleaned the kitchen, which looked as if it hadn't been cleaned in the 2 weeks the Hoovers had been in Texas. Once she was done, she located a pork roast in the cellar, which she put into the oven, and she peeled carrots and potatoes to go with it. Ernie sat at the table the whole time, eating his sandwich and watching her, as if he were worried she'd do something wrong. She had no doubt that he would run to his father if she did something that he didn't think was right. When she had dinner in the oven, she turned to the table and shooed Ernie off so she could give it a good cleaning. She then grabbed a broom and swept the floors before getting down on her hands and knees and scrubbing them. She had woken up that morning a single teacher with no prospects, and here she was now, cleaning her kitchen, a wife and a mother. Life was odd in how it threw things at her. When Jesse got home at the end of his day, he stopped at the well to splash water over his hands and face, something he hadn't done after work since his wife died. He'd always cleaned up for her before going into supper, and he felt he should afford his new wife the same courtesy, whether he wanted to or not. As his wife, she deserved his respect, even though he'd never be able to love her. When he stepped in the back door, the smell of the meat roasting brought a smile to his face. His stomach let out a loud growl, reminding him that he'd skipped lunch again. He walked into the kitchen and stopped in surprise. Everything was sparkling. It looked like even the stove had been blacked. How on earth had that tiny woman done so much work so quickly? The table was set, and she was standing at the stove stirring something. "I'm just finishing up the gravy. Go ahead and sit down and serve yourself, and by the time you're done, I'll have the gravy on the table." Jesse collapsed into the chair at the head of the table and sniffed appreciatively. "Dinner smells good." Anna turned from the counter and smiled. "It should taste good, too. I'm a good cook." She poured the gravy into a bowl and set it on the table. "Let me call Ernie, and then we'll be ready to eat." Her cooking was one thing she had a great deal of confidence in, and she was happy to be able to say she did it well. Ernie was still obviously upset as he walked into the kitchen, his eyes downcast. He took his spot at the side of the table and fixed his plate. Anna waited until both men had fixed their plates before fixing her own. "I thought you must like pork roast, because I saw some in the cellar," she said. Jesse nodded. "I've been trying to figure out how to cook one. I've had to throw 3 away just this week. It'll be nice to have someone around to do the cooking." Whatever he thought of her, whatever else she did, he was thrilled to have a woman who could cook in the house. Anna looked between the two males. "Who cooked for you back east?" Jesse shrugged. "After Deborah died, I hired a housekeeper, and she did all the cooking and cleaning." He didn't add that she had been ready to quit when they decided to move, because Ernie had been so out of control. Anna sighed. "So I'm not taking your wife's place, I'm taking the housekeeper's place." She watched Ernie out of the corner of her eye as she said the words. "I understand." She was hoping that hearing those words would make Ernie feel better about her being there. Ernie perked up. "That's right. You're just taking old Mrs. Jenkins's place. Not Ma's." He gave her a look that told her it made him feel superior to say so, but she didn't mind at all. She was happy he'd understood what she was trying to say. Jesse raised an eyebrow at Ernie. "You'll treat her with the same respect you treated your ma with, though. Won't you?" He understood Anna's purpose in the words, but he needed to know his son would be respectful. Ernie nodded reluctantly. "Yes, Pa." He looked back down at his plate, but he didn't seem nearly as upset as he had earlier. "Are you going to pray for us?" Anna asked, looking at Jesse. He nodded, and they all bowed their heads for his simple prayer. As soon as he'd finished, he stuck his fork into the pork roast and took a huge bite. He almost moaned with pleasure. His new wife really could cook. In fact, he'd never had a woman cook so well in his life. "This is good." She smiled. "I cooked a lot in the orphanage. It was one of my favorite chores." She'd always begged the other girls to trade with her when they were on cooking duty. "Orphanage? You were raised in an orphanage?" Jesse asked with surprise. She nodded. "My pa died in the last battle of the war between the states, but I was already on the way. My ma died of a fever a few weeks after I was born. There weren't any relatives who could take me in, so a neighbor found me and dropped me at the orphanage." "Where was that? Here in Texas?" he asked. Her accent didn't seem quite right for Texas. She shook her head. "No, I was raised in Beckham, Massachusetts. I've only been here 2 weeks longer than you two have." It was strange to realize she was married to a man who knew so little about her, but the circumstances were odd all around. Jesse stared at her for a moment. "You came out here to teach?" he asked. "No, I came out here to be a mail-order bride." She took a sip of water, before continuing. "I'm terribly shy, and I was nervous about coming here, so I sent a telegram to the man I was supposed to marry and told him I'd be 2 weeks late. I wanted more time to get ready." The woman who was coming here to teach school had the same last name as me, and she arrived on the stage I was supposed to be on. Somehow, she ended up married to my groom, and when I got here, he was married, but the town needed a teacher. Her eyes met his for the first time since she'd started her story. I hate teaching, but I'd done it back east, so I was qualified. It was better to take her position as a teacher than try to find something else. She didn't add that she'd been petrified that she would have nowhere to go when she arrived in town and realized what had happened. That's crazy. Why didn't she tell him that she was the teacher and not his bride? Anna shrugged. She said she kept trying to tell him, and he kept kissing her, and it muddled her brain. She hadn't understood that when Julia had first told the story, but she certainly did now. After kissing Jessie in the schoolhouse that day, she understood what it meant to have a truly muddled mind. Jessie shook his head. Did they even apologize? Yes, they did. It was an honest mistake, and really, I found Tom to be very intimidating. I don't think I'd have been able to marry him anyway. I'm extremely shy. You don't seem at all shy to me, he told her. She blushed. Well, you made me angry from the first moment we met. I was more of a fishwife with you than I'd ever been with a man. I can understand that. He looked down at Ernie for a moment, wishing he knew how to explain how much his son had changed since his mother died. We're all going to church in the morning. We go every Sunday. I'll work when we get home, though. I have a lot that needs to be done to get the ranch in shape. I purchased it sight unseen from an older couple, and the man hadn't really kept things up in a couple of years. I'd like it to be how I want it before winter rolls around. She nodded. I won't say anything about you breaking the Sabbath. I understand things like that need to happen sometimes, she sighed. I'll probably try to get some laundry and mending done tomorrow as well. It looks like there's a lot that's been neglected since you arrived. Anna's words sounded like a complaint, but her tone of voice didn't. She truly didn't mind the work, because she was glad to have it. He nodded. And we spent months on the trail before we got here. There are a lot of clothes that need to be mended. He nodded at Ernie. He's outgrown almost everything he owns. He's going to need new clothes. I don't think his pants can be taken down anymore. I enjoy sewing. It will give me something to do while he's in school. Anna smiled at Ernie, hoping he'd smile back, but he didn't. He just continued to stare through her. I hate school, Ernie moaned. I don't blame you, but school is good for you. It will help you learn to get along with others, and you can learn how to ranch on the weekends. Do you want to be a rancher like your pa someday? She knew he did, and she was ready with an answer if he said yes. Ernie nodded emphatically. I do. It's all I've ever wanted. I think I'll be a really good rancher. I should be able to stay home with him all day to learn how to ranch instead of sitting in a schoolroom learning stupid things I don't need to know. Well, don't you think there are things you can learn in school that will help you to be a better rancher? When your pa is offered money for his herd, don't you think he has to use arithmetic to decide if it's a good deal or not? What about reading? What if there's a new feed to give cattle that will make them grow up bigger and stronger? Should he keep up with that so he can keep up with the rest of his industry? I think he should. Ernie thought about it for a moment. Well, yes. He has to be able to read well and do arithmetic to make that work. So you need to learn both of those things, don't you? Ernie sighed. You tricked me. Anna smiled. I didn't trick you. I reasoned with you. They're two different things. He played with his food for a moment before taking his first bite. He'd obviously been reluctant to eat it, because she'd cooked it and his father had liked it. After the first bite, he ate quickly, washing it all down with water as fast as he could. When he'd cleaned his plate, he jumped to his feet. May I be excused? Jessie nodded, watching as his son ran from the room. He's trying really hard not to like you. I can see that. I wish I could convince him that I'm not out to replace his mother. I know he had a good mother, and that he loved her. I don't need to be that mother. She almost felt sorry for the boy, knowing he missed his mother as much as he did. What do you hope to get out of this marriage? Jessie asked suddenly, watching her face. She blinked a few times. What do you mean? Well, most women want children from marriage, but you won't get them from ours. Some want security. I don't think you'll feel that from this marriage. What exactly do you think you're going to get from it? He knew his words were cold, but he needed to be certain she had no expectations other than what he was willing to offer her. Anna shrugged, looking down at her plate. When I came out here as a mail-order bride, I was more than happy to marry the man waiting for me. I planned to be a good cook, and clean to the best of my ability. I feel like I'm very qualified to keep a home and do everything that's entailed with being a housekeeper, even with taking care of children. The only thing I was really worried about was the marriage bed. Her eyes met his. You've made it clear that you don't expect that from me, so to me, it sounds like the perfect marriage. It sounds like exactly what I want and need from you. She was very happy with the situation, even though it was an odd one. He fixed himself another plate of food as he thought over her answer. You really don't want that part of marriage? You don't want children? She shrugged. Of course, I'd like children of my own, but it doesn't hurt me not to have them. I'm going to be a stepmother to Ernie, so my maternal feelings will have an outlet of sorts. I'm glad I don't have to share your bed to fulfill that. He was surprised by her answer. My first wife wanted nothing more than to have babies. She loved the marriage bed. Anna blushed. I don't think you should be telling me that, do you? She stood up and started clearing the table, taking the water she'd started heating earlier and pouring it into the basin. She started to take away the platter with what was left of the roast on it, so she could store it away, and they could eat it for lunch the following day, but he caught her wrist. Leave it. I'll eat most of it before I'm done. I burn a lot of energy during the day, and I missed lunch today. He watched her work while he finished eating, and most of the roast was gone before he was done. He polished off all the potatoes and most of the carrots as well. She sighed when she saw what little was left. He was going to take a lot of energy for her to feed. There went her planned lunch for the following day. Once the dishes were done and the small amount of food left was put away, she climbed the stairs to get ready for bed. Ernie was sitting at the top of the stairs waiting for her. I don't want to live with my teacher. She sat down beside him on the top step, thinking hard about the best way to respond to him. You know I'm not your teacher anymore, right? There is no teacher at the school for a while. They're looking for another one. She didn't want to come right out and tell him she'd been fired, but she needed him to understand she would no longer be teaching him. No teacher? He perked up at her words. I don't have to go to school? Not until they find a new one, I guess. Do you think while you have a break from school, you can try to get used to me? I'd really like to see you act like the good boy I know you are inside, instead of showing me the kid that everyone sees. You know which one I mean. The one who's always trying to get attention and acting out in school. That boy isn't who I'm looking for. I'm looking for the boy inside you who obeys his father and does his chores when he's asked. Can you show him to me? Ernie shrugged, acting as if he didn't know what she was talking about, but she thought she may have gotten through to him. She stood up and walked to her room, closing the door with a snap behind her. She carefully unpacked her clothes, and hung them in the wardrobe before making up her bed with the sheets that had been thrown at the foot of it for her use. She would get everything cleaned upstairs soon, she promised herself. It was filthy, and no one should have to live that way. As she closed her eyes for the night, she said a silent prayer of thanks that things had worked out how they did. Jessie could be an overbearing donkey, but she was certain she would settle in nicely. She fell asleep with a smile on her lips. Life would be good in the Hoover household. She was certain of it.